Amari, and I'm the president of the Ryerson Global Management Group this year. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to our USMCA panel event. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or simply USMCA, is a free trade agreement between the three nations. It replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement, also simply known as NAFTA, and entered into force on the 1st of July, 2020. The theme of this event is leading change, and today's topic is crisis management. Before diving right into the panel discussion, let us go over the land acknowledgement. Magna. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. The event will be mainly revolving around the panel discussion and will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. So please type your questions in the Q&A section and we will ask them to the panelists at the end of their discussion. Once the Q&A session is done, we will be announcing our social media contest winners. Finally, this event will end with our closing remarks. Today's panel discussion will be moderated by Professor Michael Mengeres, the Chair of the Global Management Studies at the Tadwater School of Management, Ryerson University. However, he is not here. So I think we can go ahead. Yes.
It's Mark. I'm on with Mike right now. We're just trying to patch him in.
Okay. So I believe there are technical difficulties. No worries at all.
Thank you, Dimitri, for the opening remarks, and I'll just introduce the panel.
Okay.
Yeah. So for our panel discussion, we have four amazing panelists with us today. First of all, we have Stephen Paul Testa. Stephen Paul Testa is currently the general manager of the Diage Hospitality Group, where he has oversight of Strata's Wines and Crew wine merchants in Niagara on the Lake. Stephen recently worked at Nike Incorporated, where he held senior roles, including Chief Financial Officer for Converse North America, CFO for Nike Mexico, CFO for Nike Golf USA, and CFO for Nike Canada. Previously, he has held commercially oriented financial roles with a variety of global consumer product firms, including VP and CFO for Teva Pharmaceutical Canada, VP Finance and Information Technology, Pillsbury Canada. CFO Robin Hood Multifoods and VP Business Development at Diageo Canada. Stephen has also served as Land Trustee and Audit Committee Chair for Lakeport Brewing. Stephen earned a BBM degree from Ryerson University and became a chartered accountant in 1984. He spent 8 years at KPMG in Toronto, Canada, and he currently sits on the advisory boards for Norco Canada and AD Fontes Media in Denver, Colorado. He is a treasurer on the board of the Oakville Arts Council and is a member of the Dean's Council at the Tadwater School of Management at Ryerson University. Mark Viminitz is our next panelist and is currently the president and CEO of Sephora Medical Device Consulting Incorporated. His focus has been on helping North America business identify organizations and strategy opportunities in order to maximize profitability. He actively participates in providing international consulting companies with industry insights. In addition to consulting, Mark has been pursuing equity investments in small technology startup firms. He has been lecturing at Ryerson University in Toronto since January of 2019 in the Global Management Department, teaching classes such as Introduction to Global Management and the North American Business Environment. Mark has over 27 years of experience as management board member, vice president, general member with Johnson & Johnson Incorporated in Canada, where he successfully led commercial operations in the medical device sector. During the tenure, he has been a champion and key global contributor of several dynamic product launches, which have changed the standard of care for patients in cardiology and minimally invasive surgery. His extensive experience in effective negotiating, cross-functional management, acquisition, divestiture, business turnaround, high performance turning, strategy planning, and executive execution has provided a breadth of business expertise that aligns to a rapidly changing global business. Next, we have Vic Singh. Dr. Vic Singh is an assistant professor in the Global Management Studies program at the Ted Rogers School of Management. His research investigates the role culture plays in shaping global linkages, and in particular, the challenges China faces in stemming crisis events in an era of increasing globalization. He is also investigating how ethnicity influences housing purchases decisions in global context. He received his PhD in business from Griffith University and holds an MBA from Schulich School of Business at York University and an MA in economics from the University of Virginia. Last but not least, we have Dale Carl. Professor Carl has a BA degree in history from the Royal Military College, an MBA in international marketing from Queen's University, a certificate in language in international oil and gas from the London School of Economics, and a PhD in international strategy from the University of Calgary. In his military career, he was the Canadian Commonwealth officer working for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth and the AD camp for two Governor Generals of Canada. In his years as a Canadian diplomat, he served in Pakistan, Norway, Texas, and Iraq, where he was the acting Canadian ambassador in Baghdad leading up to the first Gulf War. He then set up a consulting firm in Dubai and later was the vice president of international marketing for a multinational firm. Covering the Middle East and Eastern Africa, Dale came to Ryerson in 2000, where he has taught international marketing, global strategy for the MBA program, the global business environment, and the Middle East business environment courses. So as you can see, we have a very accomplished panel, and we're excited to hear what they have to say today.
Dimitri? Sorry,
yeah.
Mike is having technical problems, and he wants you to, in the interim, while he's trying to log in, to take over from a moderator standpoint.
Okay, well, that was unexpected, but sure. That's my first time moderating a panel of such esteemed and amazing panelists. So, all right, let's start off. As we started with the USMCA introduction, and I hope that all of you have seen the difference between USMCA and NAFTA. I wanted to start asking questions to Stephen and Mark specifically because both of you were in the business and private sector. So from a regional business point of view, do you think that the New Deal has made any change? Do the multinational corporations like Johnson & Johnson, for instance, Mr. Viminitz, and Nike, Mr. Testa, think that this New Deal will make any change?
So I'm suggesting that since you said Johnson & Johnson first, you want me to respond to that. Okay. So there's a couple things. So there was two parts to the question that you asked. The first part was, do you think overall there's any change with this New Deal? And when you look at the real changes, they don't seem significant from the outset. So when you look at, we're going to increase intellectual property from 50 to 70 years. Even in a classroom, I say, okay, so who cares? When you talk about increasing dairy from 3.25% access that the United States has into the Canadian dairy, as an example, to 3.6, is that significant? Well, to the dairy farmers, absolutely it would be. But from an overall perspective, when you look at the numbers, I'm not so sure that it is. And there's a few other things like the sunset clause, and that when you look overall, there's not what you would call significant changes. Because remember, Donald Trump said that the NAFTA agreement was the worst deal ever made. If it was that bad, you would think that it would need to be reconstructed from square one again, which it wasn't. When you break that down to how a company like Johnson & Johnson looks at regions, you have to be realistic. Canada in the Johnson & Johnson world accounts for 2% of worldwide revenue. That's not a lot in comparison. Then you have to take a look at Johnson & Johnson generates revenue in three separate sectors, and 50% of their sales take place outside of the United States. So you have to be sensitive to the fact that there are a lot of competing interests, specifically for manufacturing, not so much for commercial ventures. So since I ran the commercial venture, most of what we talked about was where you could be in the best tax structure. So investment in Canada, really from a J&J perspective, is going to be limited because the realistic ability of Canadians to compete worldwide in manufacturing is challenging. Now, in other aspects, Canada is fantastic. So when you think about clinical studies, so I was involved in a lot of clinical work. That's a different story because Canadian clinical researchers are highly regarded, and there's a lot of tax credits depending on where you do these things. So without wanting to take up too much time on this particular question, I would say that there's not much change commercially for a J&J with the deal. I would say that if you're resource-based industry, it's going to impact you. And probably the biggest thing that happened is that I think the Americans really showed their cards as to how they feel about trade agreements. I think the sentiment is coming out, and certainly I think there's more questions that we'll be talking to about, what is their true feelings towards a country like Canada and Mexico as it relates to what this deal will look like moving forward.
Just before moving on to Mr. Testa's answer, I just wanted to touch upon, because you mentioned Mexico, I just wanted to see if Mexico was anywhere near the percentage of Canada that you mentioned, the 2%. So what about Mexico? Are they in any way helping companies such as Johnson & Johnson in terms of manufacturing or production or even in sales?
So Mexico, they do have significantly more sales in certainly the medical device sector where I worked. And it's a lot has to do with, there's also a private and public sector hospitals down there, which is different, and private usually generates more revenue. The way that Mexico attracts industry is quite significant, and they've been doing it for quite some time. So they've had an advantage. The country is elegant when you think about transportation and distribution and shipping. But if you look at the Maquiladora programs, it's really benefited one specific area of the industry that I was in, which is medical devices. There's a lot of medical device companies that have areas within northern Mexico where they do a lot of manufacturing. So manufacturing is very attractive in those sectors, if that helps.
Thank you so much. Mr. Testa, what is your stand on this question?
Sure, I'm pretty aligned with most of what Mark has come up with here. And so, I think he articulated well that, largely the changes in this agreement related to automotive, dairy, softwood, and a few other bits and pieces. And so the new legislation, except for some tinkering with textile content, likely won't have any real material impact on Nike's business in North America, given most of their supply chains connected overseas. I do think that having an agreement versus not having one, is a good thing. I think it stabilizes, first of all, it stabilizes the playing field so that companies can actually start to plan their futures with a little bit more certainty. And so, when you're working in an environment where you're not even sure what the rules are going to be, obviously you have companies who are a little bit more jittery and afraid to put a stake in the sand, afraid to make commitments on capital and resources, et cetera. So I think that's obviously a good thing that comes out of signing this thing. It also allows companies to stay on side with some of the new guideposts that are in the agreement from a strategic standpoint. So, for example, wage parity, you can extrapolate what has come out of the auto industry. And I think if you're deciding on setting up a business in Mexico in particular, or Canada for that matter, you'd want to make sure that there, you'd have some alignment with some of the major guideposts inside the agreement if you were going to if you're planning on setting something up. It sort of has already, it taught us in a very valuable way very quickly here that, you can't over-index your supply chains or decide to sell all your products in one market, even a friendly one like the US. So I think most organizations learn very quickly that diversity and diversification is a really important piece of running a global organization, or even a local one for that matter. Just an overall thought, I'm super optimistic about supply chains, in particular being, a new future prospect of wealth creation for industries around the world. Supply chain revolution, to nearshore products to markets to meet more customized and rapid consumer demand, I think will only accelerate in the future. And despite what, economic barriers exist, like these supply and demand agreements, I think you're going to see vast steps in the future here, with automation, AI, robotics, to produce goods in a way that makes current manufacturing processes seem obsolete. And there are already industries that are leading this with great example. And I think this can be done in a more cost-effective way without carting products halfway around the world, which in this millennium just seems like it doesn't make any sense anymore. And so I think that sort of summarizes it from my point of view.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer. Michael Mangiris is here, and Mr. Professor Mangiris, the floor is yours if you want to continue with the questions. We just finished the first question.
My apologies. Don't ask me what happened.
No,
Technology's been frustrating. I've been on Zoom all day with no issues, and suddenly I have an issue.
No
My
worries.
apologies to everybody for being late. Dimitri, I think that you're doing a fine job. Continue on.
I think the attendees came here to listen to you ask the questions, because obviously there's a huge difference between you and I. So if you want, please, you can have the floor.
Welcome to the corporate world, Dimitri.
All right, I will.
Thank you.
Dimitri, you've taken care of the first question, both to Stephen and Mark, is that correct?
Yes.
All right, then the next question, and we'll ask first of all, Dr. Dale Carl, this one. From a global point of view, Dr. Carl, how different is, in reality, how different is the USMCA compared to its predecessor, NAFTA?
It's not like, and it was actually just stated by both Mark and Stephen, especially by Mark, it's not incredibly different from NAFTA. This time, they didn't have to worry about some of the things they did in NAFTA. And when I was in Texas, one of my jobs there from 1987 to 1989 was convincing the American oil and gas big companies to sign on and stop lobbying against NAFTA. And this time in the United States, aside from Donald Trump supporting the dairy farmers and the aluminum producers and just smaller groups like that, there was no major opposition in the United States to this. We had probably more opposition to it because it was going to potentially extend the automobile rules on origin. And Donald Trump initially said 85% of any automobiles had to be made in North America. And that was really frightening for us. Now, it ended up going down to 75%, up from 62.5 under NAFTA. And so that was actually a huge difference for us. The other thing I think was really different about this, not just in the auto sector, but it applies to the auto sector, is that they actually talked about labor, and especially in terms of Mexico, and what would be the minimum wage, which they settled at $16 an hour for the Mexican auto workers that were going to be part of this agreement, selling automobile or parts or whatever into the North American market. And I think that was a big part of it that they actually went into, is actually getting into labor. They also talked about environmental issues. Now, it didn't get very far because of Donald Trump and his whole administration, but nonetheless, it was actually put there on the playing field for discussion. And that was very different from NAFTA. In the old NAFTA days, when we set up NAFTA, no one was really that concerned. But now it sort of brought recent issues. What is important now in this world? And despite the fact that it actually didn't really get written into the agreement, nonetheless, it was discussed. And I think that was very important. But overall, as Mark said right from the start here, it's not amazingly different. Like we expected it to be, especially because we're basically under duress. When we talk about crisis management, which we will, that it happened quickly, but finally we got like our ducks together and all sides agreed very, very quickly. Whereas NAFTA, wow, that was huge in trying to negotiate because there were so many people in all three countries that didn't want it, except in Mexico, because Mexico could see where it was actually going to benefit them so much, like in the maquiladoras and stuff like that. But there was a huge pushback. But in Canada, we wanted it. And so I think that was a big difference. But ultimately, the final agreement, which could change, really didn't change much for us in Canada. A bit more access on the dairy market, and I come from a dairy farm, so yes, that was a big discussion. But nonetheless, it wasn't devastating. It was a very small change. And the same thing with our other production of eggs. I wrote them down here. Yeah, so our supply management system was challenged. And I think that was interesting because it's being challenged in all of our negotiations with other countries, either bilateral or in things like the TPP. And so we have to review that system. So I think that that was challenged this time, much more so than the last time. That's it. You're on mute, Mike.
Thank you very much. As I say, technically challenged today for some reason. My next question is to you, Dr. Vic Singh, and it's very similar. Again, it's this question about, is the USMCA really different than NAFTA? But what is the point of view of, say, the financial industry or the automotive industry over in Asia as they look to the USMCA, either as a benefit or a hindrance or a difference or nothing?
Thank you, Mike. Maybe I can talk more about the automotive sector. And I think one of the key implications of the new agreement is that the content of the vehicle and the cap they've actually increased the cap to 75%, which means that the North American footprint of a vehicle manufactured in North America should be 75% from 62.5%. Now, that sounds pretty trivial, but when you actually do the math, it is pretty significant in terms of the cost, which adds to the to a vehicle manufacturing, and especially in a day and age where we look at a global sourcing of parts, especially from low-cost jurisdictions, such in Asia, such as China, obviously Vietnam, and even India, that increases the cost of production for North American vehicle manufacturers. So in fact, when you look at the intent is to actually improve production or increase production in North America. But to me, it's actually counterproductive because it actually increases the cost, makes the competitive positioning of automotive sector in North America weaker compared to the counterparts in Asia, and also prevents global companies. And we're talking about companies who work on a global scale. And as Mark pointed out, to them, regions don't really matter because the whole world is the oyster for them. And to limit them to North America and increase their cost of production, I think is very problematic going forward. The other thing which I find is really interesting is when you look at the agreement, there is an Article 32.1 in the agreement, which basically gives the U.S. the veto power against any of the other two countries entering into an FTA, and it's aimed towards. And if you go through the reading, it talks about the consequence of negotiating an FTA with a non-market economy. It's basically aimed towards China. So if Canada and which we were actually for a long period of time, trying to enter into an FTA with China. And as a sovereign country, we would have to actually ask for US, we have to give a notice to US for 3 months notice. And then US actually has the right to exit by giving us a 6-month notice period. So basically, it's actually a hidden threat that you cannot enter into an FTA with China without getting our permission. More likely, as Donald Trump intended to, was American posturing and giving an in versus out mentality, either with us or with them. And I think that's really troublesome, especially in a global environment like today with the increase in geopolitical risks. And we've seen the outcome. We've seen the recent, where the biggest World Trade Agreement was just formulated a few days ago, the RCEP, where China came with the other Asian countries, minus US, minus Canada, and minus India. And India was, there's still some uncertainty whether it will come in. But this is a huge trade agreement which was just formulated. And I think it's something we have to consider going forward, because Canada, and when you look at Canada, we are highly dependent on exports. We are highly dependent on global sourcing of products and parts, and our companies are vulnerable to increase in cost, especially when you look at a global marketplace.
Thank you. Stephen, hello. Stephen, I want to ask the next question of you, and this relates to just one of those geopolitical events or things that risks that have affected all of us starting at the beginning of this year, and that's COVID-19. You know, stopping the spread of COVID-19 is paramount, certainly in the minds of many governments, and around the world. Initially, back in February, March, the initial approach was just shut the economy down completely and flatten out the curve. And this time around, as we've sort of are well into the second wave, we're seeing governments at various levels being reluctant in a complete shutdown. Given that a complete shutdown can go against the interests of a business or an industry sector, what do you believe is the best way to deal with the virus and keep the economy going, or keep some parts of the economy going?
A tough question. Yeah, I'm not sure I really view it as a clash as much as, businesses now being required to develop some new muscles on how to navigate, immediate threats and realities that are kind of served up. And so almost like the last subject we talked about, vis-a-vis a trade agreement, these are big deals. And for a lot of organizations, there's a lot of details in trying to navigate around how you respond. But I think businesses have begun to capitalize on how to accelerate in very new and imaginative ways to reach consumers with products and services. If you think about the explosion of the DTC channel, the direct-to-consumer channel, I feel like that's accelerated that entire marketplace probably by 5 to 10 years, just this one event alone. And so, in this regard, companies are reevaluating their entire org structures, their employees' skill base, their go-to-market practices, which is going to really change the landscape of how businesses run their commerce and how they execute things for now and into the future, virus or no virus. I think that it's fair to say that companies have used this pause as a chance to rethink their entire business models and the talents that are going to be required in order to thrive in the future. And I think it's a great underlying result on how creative we've been this year, despite the backdrop of pretty devastating pandemic. I just consider the vast changes, in how the education system, how things are being run at TRSM, and the Ryerson leadership around pivoting an entire model to educate everybody that's online here, almost overnight. And so I have a big faith that businesses are very resilient, and that there are consumers out there, and we'll find new ways to wire in order to service consumers with goods and services. So in spite of everything that's happened to us here, I feel optimistic.
Thank you, Stephen. It's nice to hear somebody optimistic, especially over the last couple of months. Next question, Mark, is to you. And again, it deals with COVID-19. You know, we're certainly well into a second wave. We're seeing record cases, both in Canada and the United States. Certainly the United States perhaps is in a little worse shape in terms of that data or that statistic. Do you have any thoughts on what, you know, the long-term effect of all this is going to be on our economies in North America and also on business globally?
So first of all, on a personal note, you know, I spend half the year in Arizona and have not been able to get down to our place because of the border restrictions. Now, I could fly, but my wife also let me know today that our neighbors 2 doors down tested positive for COVID. So, you know, there's a reluctance to want to be in the United States. I feel much safer here in Canada than I probably would be in the US based on how cavalier they've been with relation to the impact. And you know, we were pretty involved in SARS in 2003. I mean, here at Johnson, when I was at Johnson & Johnson, we actually helped the hospitals to design protocols to make sure that there was safety protocols for people coming in and out of the institutions. To Stephen's point earlier, that definitely will change how customer facing happens or consumer facing happens moving forward, because we planned for a pandemic, but we never really had to be this extensive into it. I think, you know, essential services, I think there's a lot of people that are still crossing through the borders. So I'm not sure how tight those restrictions have been for non-essential travel. I could book a flight tomorrow and I can fly to Arizona. However, if I got in my car and drove to the border, there's a greater than 50% chance that I won't get across. From an economic standpoint, this opens up such a big issue. If you remember, the US debt after Obama was finished was 18 trillion. That increased 8 trillion from the time that he came into power over an 8-year span. Since our 4-year insight into Trump, we've gone from 18 trillion to 27 trillion, with the thought of tax breaks and some of these other issues that were supposed to generate significant revenue, and this was all supposed to work. And you know, corporations that got the tax breaks did not use them for the entirely, some did, but entirely for the purposes that it was designed for. And if you look at individual taxes, they were really relatively insignificant. There's a broader issue here on isolation and protectionist policies that have been happening over the last 4 years that have been amped up because of the pandemic. We, I think collectively as a group, had talked about that the US, Canada, and Mexico, because we're so intimately tied together, we're headed for a recession in 2020 anyways. The pandemic really accelerated the drop. And I think, you know, this is going to be very difficult to get out of. And as a personal taxpayer, I think this is something that it makes me nervous, because I know where the tax burden will be placed upon moving forward. The economy is going to be slow to get out of this. Some parts may not recover, although corporate socialism is alive and well, both in the United States, Mexico, and Canada. So I think there will be some help, but it's going to take a while. This is not, we've never really faced into a modern era pandemic that has affected us this significantly. And if you saw the caseload today, highest in the United States, highest number of deaths, highest number of hospitalizations, you know, you can't just use cases as sort of the benchmark, and a disturbing trend across Canada. So if we're headed for another lockdown as we get into the holiday season, how do we get out of this by next summer? Hard to say. I think the jury's out on this.
Thank you. Vic, which economic sectors do you think in Canada will be sort of hardest hit, in the long term because of COVID-19?
Well, we already seen the retail, the hospitality and tourism sector suffer dramatically. And I think the pain is just going to continue on because what's happened is that it's taken a lot against the consumer confidence. The consumer confidence is not there. And even if the vaccine comes out and things go back to semi-normal, I think that there is going to be some changes in consumer behavior. And we're seeing that anyways, right? Especially in retail, we're seeing direct-to-consumer, supply chains, the direct-to-consumer marketing is going to increase. To give you an example, I've never shopped groceries online. I've been doing it for the last few months. I'm very comfortable. I'm not going back to a grocery store again. And I was one of those persons who used to go grocery shopping very frequently in a grocery store. Just to give you an example, I think that's going to have a huge implication, not just on the front end, but also on the back end in terms of supply chain going forward. The other sector which really, really worries me is our real estate market. And given the way the real estate market has gone, and if you look at the numbers, if you look at it as a sector, has been the prime contributor in keeping our economy as stable as it could have been during the pandemic. Now, we've seen that in US, the weakness is cropping up. We've seen today there was a dispute happening between the Federal Reserve and Treasury in terms of stopping the subsidies they've been providing to the market in terms of the monetary easing. We've seen that happen in Canada too. Bank of Canada had publicly stated that they're going to stop buying mortgage bonds, which means that it could have an implication going forward in terms of our debt, the amount of debt we've been holding and the debt services we've been holding as a consumer, and that can have direct implication on the property. And we're seeing a softening of the property market, especially in the condo division in Toronto. We're seeing the exodus from Toronto from the micro condos to the suburbia, and that's putting a squeeze. So my biggest worry going forward is not just the sectors such as retail, hospitality, but a prime driver of our economy, which is the real estate market. And if that collapses, that's going to have a huge implication, and that's going to hit every aspect of our economy and our well-being.
Vic, thank you. Dale, my next question is to you. How do you think governments around the world and multinationals are going to cooperate after the pandemic's done to try to, we just heard from both Mark and Vic, to try to change all those outcomes to something more positive? How do you see that cooperation happening? What do you think they have to do?
First of all, I think they have to start working now on fighting the pandemic in underdeveloped countries. And I think that, potentially led by the WHO, the World Health Organization, if we finally agree that we have to support those countries, then that would allow us to work together. It's not something like NATO. We're worried about what's going to happen in Europe in terms of anything militarily or whatever. But I think that actually countries are going to start cooperating because they have to build the rest of the world economically, but also socially, but certainly from a health perspective, because COVID-19 is not going to be over when we start rolling out vaccinations for people if we don't actually spread this all over the world, because COVID-19 will then just continue. It'll spread. We're global, we travel, and that will happen. So I think that companies or countries will actually start working together, as will companies. And I mentioned companies deliberately there. The other big thing is when we kick Trump out of the White House. And Joe Biden has always been an international diplomat. He sees the power in alliances. He sees the power in the United States taking leadership. And I think that when he becomes the president on January 20th, that he will be a catalyst working with the other governments to start working together. He will support the United Nations. He will support NATO. He will support all kinds of different things, including bilateral agreements like the Paris Climate Change Agreement and things like this. So I think that because we will have so many common interests after this that we start to focus on, that world leaders will come together and hopefully the United States will take its rightful place, which it used to have. I'm not saying they should be the world policeman, but as a leader, and Canada will do the same thing. I think probably one of the things we've seen from this whole crisis with people driving less and less production and all that stuff is a cleaner environment, even in India. And so I think people are going to be focused on that. This is going to be a new thing that brings us all together. And especially if we have the United States as a game player in that, as opposed to someone that's just sitting out and saying, doesn't matter, it doesn't exist. So I think that the world leaders will come together. They've just gone through a crisis. They have to support each other economically because we're going to try to rebuild the world. And it's not just Canada, the United States, Mexico, which we're talking about tonight, but every economy has been hurt. China's the only one that's really doing reasonably well right now because they tackled this very quickly. And they just joined this trade agreement. And just in terms of that as well, I think there are going to be a lot more trade agreements, and that's the theme for tonight. We're just negotiating one right now with the UK, which they hope to have ready for the 30th of December, maybe. But I think in terms of bilateral agreements, that we will be reaching out to more, especially now that they have this new one with China in Asia, that's going to scare a lot of people. And I think we're going to work much more closely together, basically to buffer that. I'm not saying that because the TPP, we're already partners with a whole bunch of those countries anyway. But at the same time, I think, especially in the Western countries, those governments are going to be working more closely together economically to make the world a safer place, but also to make our economy stronger and grow more quickly. And as I said, I think this is probably an outcome of COVID-19. Did I answer the question?
You did. Thank you, Dale. Stephen, I have one for you, and it's kind of along the same lines, but I think I want to narrow it down a little bit. Do you think that Nike has a role to play in rolling out the vaccine globally? And does it make good business sense?
Yeah, I mean, hypothetically, I'm a big fan of organizations who behave like individuals, that they have, values, they have a point of view. Dale just kind of said it in a really articulate way, that we now have a higher appreciation for what's important to us all from a personal standpoint. And there's a big global community out there that we are all part of, and we have a very important role to play as catalysts. And so I think if organizations around the world, the bigger ones that have the might, they have the supply chain, they have the resources, I think it would be great for a company like Nike and others to step up here to help, distribute vaccines, to do whatever it needs to do in order to, again, start down the road to consolidating our world, because there is going to be a lot of fallout from this. It's really hard to believe that, the markets and the economies are going to keep rolling the way they have. And so my short answer is yes, I have hope that people will pitch in here and, as we say at Nike, do the right thing.
Which is kind of why I asked you the question, because I know about their saying. Does it make good business sense for Nike?
I don't think there's any other way. I think that businesses today are, they're under the microscope. They have to constantly be looking and questioning the practices of what they do, and making sure that aligns with people's values, the things that are important to people, and not in a way that's overt or that says, hey, we're going to take advantage of a situation here in order to help us market and sell more sneakers. They'll do it because it's the correct thing to do. And And so and you're seeing, small examples of this happening all over the place with, small organizations and manpower, just popping up out of the woodwork here and helping ordinary people and solving the day-to-day issues that we've all experienced around this pandemic. And so I'm encouraged by what I see. And I think on a big global scale with some of the large players that are out there, I think we can mobilize a lot of good. And so, yes, I think it makes enormous sense.
Thank you. My last question is to you, Mark. And this has to do with, coming back to the whole idea of NAFTA versus USMCA. And we know that Mr. Trump, it was an election promise on his behalf. He talked about how NAFTA was the worst, as a quote, was the worst deal ever that the United States had signed on to. And then, as we just heard from yourselves, he renegotiates a deal that is essentially the same thing, just with a new label. However, Joe Biden won the election and will be taking, despite Mr. Trump's efforts, will be taking over the White House on January 20th. So it will be up to Joe Biden to actually implement the New Deal. Do you see any risks to business or any issues or any opportunities as a result of Mr. Biden taking over related to the fact that he'll be implementing the USMCA?
So thanks for the question. I guess to frame the answer, the first thing that I would say is that although the conversations with Canada from the United States and with Mexico will be more civil and appropriate, the sentiment that's, from my perspective, is that the United States is the methodology that they are going to use to do business with us now will very little change. If you look at how the original NAFTA was voted on, both in the House and in the Senate, it was predominantly Democrats in 1993 that were against the deal. And although, as Dale pointed out, which is absolutely accurate, that there was much more openness to signing a new deal from the general population, 93% of the people that voted against in the House and in the Senate, although a small number, they were all Democrats. So the Democrats aren't necessarily enamored by this trade deal. As a matter of fact, the research that I've done says they want more out of it. I hate to say this, I tend to think that the United States really wants more of unilateral deals than they want bilateral and trilateral. And I think the reason for that, which Vic touches on, is that China scares the hell out of them. And if you do the math, China's economy is going to be larger than the United States within 10 years. I think I calculated to 12, but all bets are off now because of what's happened with the pandemic. These are real issues that impact us. So when you think about how we're going to be dealt with, I've always viewed that Donald Trump over the last 4 years, what he did from a trade perspective with us and the rest of the world is he picked a scab off on some festering issues that have been dealt with sort of a little bit at a time or in a nice way and then pulled back. He just let all of that go and he just said, here's the way it's going to be. Why, if you are seriously negotiating when you're in a position of power that he's established for you, that you can do it in a much more civil way, still look like a hero and drive the agenda of the United States, both in Canada and in Mexico. And the reality is, that was pointed out earlier, we're in between a rock and a hard place. With 75% of our exports from Canada that goes to the United States and 75% from Mexico into the United States, unless we figure out a way that we can expand our trade with other countries around the world to reduce that reliance on the United States, I think it's going to get tougher for us. I think this is the tip of the iceberg of things that are going to happen that are going to be tougher to negotiate moving forward. First thing is going to be that pipeline. The Obama administration was not supportive of the pipeline that's moved from Alberta into BC and down into the United States. And we'll see whether that is one of the first things that they tackle to actually, either permit it to continue, or whether they're going to pull the permits related to any movement on that. That'll give you a pretty good sign of where our negotiations will go with the United States moving forward on several issues.
Thank you, Mark. And that brings us pretty much to 7 o'clock. So I think over the next 15 minutes, we'll open up the floor to questions. Now, there is a Q&A button you can see down on the bottom right of your screen, and a number of people have already used it to identify some questions to ask. So I'm going to go ahead and read or ask one of them. The first one, however, is not there, and it comes from the conversation, Mark, that or the comments, Mark, that you just provided. And that is this idea that Canada should maybe be thinking about other trade agreements as well, and not putting all their hockey pucks in one bucket, so to speak. One kind of potential trade area that's being discussed, and Dale, this relates back to your comment about a negotiated trade deal with the UK, is to expand that concept and have a trade deal that includes Australia and New Zealand as well. And it's now commonly being referred to as CANZUK. C for Canada, A for Australia, NZ for the Netherlands, and then UK at the end. Is this viable, and what do people, this is open to anybody on the panel, is this viable, and what should be sort of the template used that it, offers the best benefits for Canada?
Okay, no one wants to answer it. So first of all, how much trade do we do with them? Because that's what's really important. Do we produce different things that they don't produce, that they would like to buy from us? And I think that's where you start. You look for commonalities, or where we can actually help each other out. And I don't know enough about New Zealand or Australia. I know Australia sells all kinds of coal, which is horrible. But aside from that, like they produce dairy, like in New Zealand, and the same things we do that we're trying to protect. And so I'm not sure what the fit would be. Also, literally just the distance. And as we get into a more environmentally friendly market, and this was mentioned by, I think, Mark or Stephen at the start, is that people are going to be shortening some of their supply chains and also delivery. And I think that's important because they're a long ways away. And like, well, it's the Pacific Ocean that's in the way. But at the same time, what would be the advantage to us? I just don't know. Are they interested? Are we probing that? Mike, you asked the question.
Well, yes, and the answer to the last part is yes, we are. We Canada are investigating it. And from my sources, both in the EU and the UK, one of the benefits to the UK is that they want a free trade deal with somebody, because there's a concern that the hard Brexit scenario is going to happen. Right. And the UK are looking for a political success and believe that a widening free trade area, with Commonwealth nations is a good first step. I'm not sure I see a benefit for Canada, which is exactly what you said, Dale. And I think that, as this is probed by officials on all sides, that's a key question that has to be asked. Because as you said, one of the reasons we haven't got an increase in trade right now with any of these countries is distance. And one of the reasons we do have such a large amount of trade with the United States and Mexico is because of distance. They're right next door. So thank you for that. I have a question from...
I would ask Mike, sorry to interrupt it, is that Canada benefits from multilateral agreements. The more the merrier from a Canadian perspective. And I was just looking in my notes. I mean, we have we have 10 bilateral agreements with different countries right now, mainly identified in Central America, some over in Israel and Europe. And I think that had the negotiations continued on the TPP, that would have been a very good benefit for us. Obviously, the United States didn't think that way, but you know, this agreement that Vic identified, that's going to be the largest free trade agreement in the world, and that's a big play here. And I believe Australia is and New Zealand are part of that agreement.
Right.
And you know, for us now to have to be concerned because to try to join that agreement with China being a key member, this will be an interesting test of the World Trade Organization.
Thank you, Mark. Let me go through a couple of the other questions. We're getting lots of them coming in now. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get to all of them. This one is just from one of our attendees. And this is to anybody again on the panel. Will the recovery, the economic recovery that we see after the pandemic is, shall I say, managed with a vaccine, will it be shaped like a V or will it be shaped like a U? And Vic, maybe we should start with you on this one.
That's a really tough question. To me, it's all based on how far the pain from the pandemic will continue on. I mean, just because two companies have announced successful vaccine trials and outcomes doesn't mean they will have a vaccine. And there's also a logistic issue behind it in terms of production and also getting it out. So I think to answer this question in a very simplistic term would be it's basically based on how far the pandemic is going to continue and how bad this winter is going to be in terms of the rates of people getting infected. Will there be a full lockdown? We're already seeing a lot of pains in other countries too. We're seeing U.S. obviously suffering a lot in terms of economics. We're also seeing the virus really flaring up in jurisdictions like India, and we're seeing Europe now facing the second wave. So I think it will take a while. It's really hard to say. I don't think it'll be a V-shaped recovery as some of the optimists have been pointing out. I'm more of a realistic here. More likely a dragged on U-shape or maybe a K, where certain sectors will probably come out faster than others. But it all based on how far this pandemic is going to continue and how quickly the consumer confidence is going to come back on. I should also highlight, as Mark pointed out, we already at a business cycle where we're looking at a recession. We were looking at a recession before the start of the pandemic. So I think that's also going to cause issues going forward. Even though we come out of pandemic, it's going to create a lot of economic disparities within the sectors and also between countries. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, but it's all based on how far the pandemic is going to continue on.
Thank you, Vic. Here's another question, and I'm going to direct it, I think, to you, Stephen. This relates to the USMCA agreement. The agreement itself does discuss anti-corruption in businesses and government across the three nations. Do you believe that it will in any way help to reduce corruption in North America?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm informed enough to, make an intelligent comment here one way or the other. I mean, having lived in Mexico for a couple of years, they have a real rule of law problem down there. There's a lot of corruption. It's pretty widespread inside the country, but they're aware of it. My sense is that people, in amongst all of this COVID activity, have been uber sensitive about what happens at their borders, and so in a way, you almost can maybe draw the conclusion here that given that there's been that much attention paid to what goods cross our borders and how people are migrating back and forth, that perhaps the corruption rates have slowed down, but that's just pure speculation. on my part. So I don't think I can give you a good answer on this one. Sorry.
I think what I would add,
Actually, you just did.
I think what I would add to Stephen's comment is that there's a piece of legislation in the United States that has a significant amount of teeth and make executives around the world very nervous, and that's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And the fact that that's there, you know, I was in a lot of meetings related to how we have to deal with these types of issues, because the last thing that you want is an American authority coming up into Canada or wherever and pulling the executive down to the United States to stand trial for corruption. That is a big no-no in multinationals. It's a hot topic. So, you know, even if you're not a fiduciary, you become concerned about how you act. It's not perfect, especially because multinationals tend to acquire a lot of different companies. Bringing in those companies, they aren't necessarily aligned to the rules and regulations that some of these companies have to follow, especially young startups. But it's significant, and it does make big companies worry. So I think it has an impact.
Thank you, Mark. Dale, this one's for you. With Canada's supply chain and just-in-time coming under scrutiny recently, do you think that Canada should further develop our manufacturing sector?
We actually used to be very strong manufacturers. And unfortunately well, I'm not saying unfortunately, fortunately perhaps for the consumer, because of the global supply chains and offshoring and building so many things in other countries, that we basically outsourced a lot of our manufacturing and our jobs. We are great at the service sector, and that's what has really made us really powerful. But now we're going to start working on other things. And just some of the announcements recently, we're going to be looking at producing electric vehicles and charging stations and all of those other things in Canada. That will be a new industry that will actually revitalize, like the GMs and all of those plants that are basically losing favor from their headquarters in the United States. But also we can become leaders in non-traditional energy sources, okay, new sources of energy. And I think that we will be able to sell that all over the world. But also, I think we have to get an act together, because after the pandemic's over, people are going to flood to Canada. And I think that despite what the government may want to do in limiting the numbers coming in, I think that we are going to be a hot destination for so many people. So we have to have other types of jobs. Right now, we have a lot of small manufacturers or restaurants or service sector people that are actually going out of business, and they will have to be able to restart as well. So we will have to build our economy, but that involves new manufacturing. And I think that we actually have to focus on various types of manufacturing. A lot of it will be with robotics and AI and other things, but people will still be involved in all kinds of different jobs. We just have to train them how to do that, how to become part of that new economy. And so while some of it will be manufacturing, it will be a different form of manufacturing, I think, in the future. And we just have to train the people to do that. But we also have to revive the service sectors, because that's so important to so many people. But also because we have so many entrepreneurs in Canada, and we'll have so many more that have lost their jobs, but have great ideas. And so each of these industries we start up will be a hub for a huge, huge supply chain. And this is sort of the just-in-time idea that if you set up a hub here, then around it, there'll be all kinds of suppliers and other people that are working with them. That, yes, maybe we won't be working all the way across Canada, and we will have sort of small hubs, but people will work together as we rebuild our new economy, which is going to be focused on the new things, not the old things.
Thank you, Dale, and thank you, Aidan Thate, for that particular question. He himself is a student leader. Dale, your comments actually lead into this last question. This is our final question for today. We had many more. We just simply didn't have the time to get to them all. And I'll just read it out because it's very well worded. As a young student of today, in the climate that we live in currently, we have learned to be extremely adaptable in order to survive. These are the students. What other skill sets do you think would complement alongside adaptability in order for our success in the global business environment? And if I may, Mark, could you take this one first, and then maybe Stephen, if you could follow up?
So I immediately thought of keeping your elbows up. Canadians tend to be nice. And having worked as long as I've worked for a US corporation, you really have to make room for yourself, which translates to you got to get in the door. And then once you're in, then you've got to work your way through the system, depending on what type of organization it is. But there's a level of intensity that you have to bring to the table, whether it's how you prepare for your classes and how you prepare for interviews and extra work that you're prepared to do. It's a much more competitive environment. The one thing that I will tell you that I do relate in the classroom is when I ask the students, what expectation they have of being able to get a job with an undergraduate degree. When I left my position as running the commercial operations, my entry-level associate product manager, so this is indentured slave, first level of marketing job that you can get, was an MBA with 7 years of business experience. So you can see how competitive it's become. So things like you're doing today, being part of panels, being part of associations, and the more that you can do to show that you're willing to go the extra. And personality plays a big role in this. Some of the softer skills you cannot ignore. It doesn't work that you may be the smartest person in the room. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will get hired. So, the ability to be able to have those one-on-one conversations, which is more difficult now because you have a lot of technology that prevents you from necessarily having face-to-face conversations. That is a key. Whether you join, like the Ryerson has a sales association that gives you the competitions and being able to get out there. Hiring people recognize those things, and that's what you have to be focused on. It's the softer skills moving forward, and it's the softer skills that help you as you get into higher realms of the organization. It's not technical capabilities. It's people management. It's empathy. It's all those social skills that become critical if you want to move up. And I'm just giving the perspective of a multinational. If you're an entrepreneur and you have your own company, it's a different ballgame for you. But if you want to enter the realm of multinationals and these big $80 billion a year companies like I worked in, that's what you got to do to get in.
I certainly could attest to the technical problems of communicating with people, given that I was late joining today. Stephen, you want to take a shot at it?
Yeah, Mark covered a lot of ground there. So yeah, for me, it's a couple of things, and you said it right at the end. This concept of EQ versus IQ. Everything that we do revolves around others. And so to the extent that you have the skills to recognize what people's motivations are, what makes them tick, how to work with them, how to inspire them, how to lead them, I think you're going to be in really good shape. And so I would say that the EQ is the new. Well, it's not all that new, but I think it's really the secret sauce of perfecting your ascension in any business. And so it's really how you're interacting with others, how you make them feel, that I think is the most important thing. And then I think this adaptability thing for me sort of crosses the line into creativity, which innovation and creativity are the things that we need. There are oxygen. When tough environments hit us, it's then that you see how people are able to be nimble, how they're able to go left and right and overcome obstacles that one would initially think might be not you wouldn't be able to overcome. And so I think that level of hope, that level of there's always a solution, rethinking what you're doing with purpose, I think you hit on it with your adaptability comment, but I would frame it as really this concept of creativity and innovation. So I would say EQ, IQ, innovation, and creativity, two really important things.
Thank you, Stephen. A couple of other questions came forward as well, and they all revolved around, and I know I'm going a little bit over time. Dimitri gave me permission to do so in the chat line over there. But there a number of questions from participants revolve around this idea that after COVID, which industries are most likely to A, survive, and B, thrive? And they're thinking, I believe, and now I'm reading into this, but I'm thinking they're looking at, which industries should we be preparing for to apply to for employment? And that's open to anybody in the panel.
Healthcare.
So should they all become healthcare, like nurses and doctors?
Look, I think you've got to look at even before this. If you look at industries that do well throughout recessions, because at the end of the day, this is really an economic exercise that's on steroids. That's what you should be looking for. But if you don't think that airlines are going to bounce back, if you don't think that car manufacturers are going to bounce back, and if you don't think that companies like Carnival, like the cruise ship industry, they will all make a recovery, because if you look in their history, they've all had issues like we've dealt with, like we're facing into, and have all come out of it. A lot of it has to do with government help, but these are, what's the word, or the line, too big to fail. So, smaller businesses and smaller industries, they're going to have a tough time, but it's purely because they're just not generating the revenue. So I don't know if I answered that, but.
Anybody else?
Dick wants to say something.
Oh, if I may add to this, I think technology is here to stay, and we're going to see a complete acceleration of technology, which is going to touch every facet of industries. We're already seeing that. We're seeing robo-investing, for example, is becoming quite prominent, especially with the change in consumer behavior. I think that's a key right now. The consumer behavior, when we look at it as a structural aspect, has changed, and has changed dramatically. So companies who are resilient, who have adopted technology, who are willing to adopt technology moving forward, are the ones who are going to survive. They're going to thrive. And we're going to see sectoral changes too. We're going to see the way we shop, for example, the way we interact with people. I think virtual work is here to stay, even though it would not be 100% what we've seen right now. But I think a lot of the companies are going to figure out that it's cheaper, more productive to have workers work virtually as teams. So I think my advice would be to keep technology in mind wherever you're applying. Technology is here to stay. If you're in marketing, data analytics is going to get much more extreme. We're also seeing a lot of people are sourcing products. I think global supply is going to accelerate, even though some of the trade agreements are kind of restricting them. So my suggestion would be to keep an open mind, but keep technology in mind as you go forward, as you look for jobs, as you look for industries and sectors that you want to work in.
And just outline the one thing that just said, data analytics is going to be so essential for almost every type of business. And so if you have the option of taking a course in that or courses in that, do it now, okay? At least understand what it's about so you can actually follow through with it later on and hopefully even get a co-op job doing something like that. if you can reach out that way, train yourself to be a valuable member of the future for large corporations or even for small businesses. It's absolutely critical to marketing. It's critical to looking at your customers, to reaching out to partners, to tracking stuff around the world. Data analytics is huge.
Thank you, Dale. I would just add to that, recently a report came out today that Warren Buffett is starting to sell off stocks and buy gold. So does that mean we're in for a very large market crash? Hard to say. But what you just heard from panel members for your future is strategies to prepare yourself to, in essence, be protected against fluctuations in the market up and down. And certainly technology and data analytics are two such ways of doing that. In other words, the way things have been done in the past simply won't be done in the future. And it's important to prepare yourself with that and not to forget the human side. So you're going to have to ask for money if you're working in a company. How do you tell the story? How do you back it up? There's courses that help you to establish that. And anyone that's here that's in GMS 850 knows exactly what I'm talking about. And anyone that's not, but is a GMS major will be in GMS 850 and then will know what I'm talking about. But it isn't just that course. It's the regional courses that are taught by all the panel members here. It's also the courses that you've taken early on in your program, quantitative courses. Quantitative courses exist so that you can somehow create numbers to support what it is you're saying or what it is you want to do. And that is a tremendous skill that you'll need when you get out into the workforce. So those skill sets are very important no matter which industry you go into that you just heard about or which size of company you choose to work within. And with that,
okay. Well, just before you go, last plug, take your MBA at Ryerson.
fair enough.
Sorry, I'm the director of graduate students, and we have one of the top MBAs, but we were actually just judged as number 8 in the world in terms of sustainability in our MBA program. And so that was absolutely amazing. But we teach data analytics. You have to do it. We teach all the latest things that are going on, but you require 2 years of work experience first, just so that you can build on that, build on the leadership, on your working with other people, networking, empathy, all of these things we've discussed tonight. But I just want to throw that plug in there. Sorry about that, Mike. Okay.
It's okay, Dale, you're allowed shameless promotion. We absolutely are happy to have you do it. So again, thank you everybody on behalf of the Global Management Studies Department. I would like to thank our RGMG group, but I would also like to thank our panel members for their time and for being here tonight.